Okay, everyone, I have 9 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's really pretty outside, so I hope everyone gets a chance to step outside at some point today and breathe in some of the fresh air. We want to thank you all for joining us this morning. First of all, I just want to say that our staff at the Marion Chamber has been keeping the business community and the Marion community as a whole in our thoughts. And in many, many cases, business has not stopped working, and the Marion Chamber hasn't either. We will overcome this interesting time, and this virtual meeting is the first in a series of several that the Marion Chamber has organized in response to COVID-19. I want to remind everyone, I think everyone should be, when you enter the call, you should be on mute. But if you have questions, we want to make sure that everyone's using the chat function. Should be a little bar at the bottom of your screen. Use that chat function to answer questions, or ask questions this morning, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's question. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to briefly mention, and I think there should be a slide, with all of the additional upcoming virtual meetings we have scheduled. We have 6 of them, I believe. One of them, Virtual Wake Up Marion, is a virtual networking meeting that we're going to give a try on Thursday at 8:30 a.m. So we hope that you guys will be able to join us for that. The other calls that are scheduled are all business process or operations calls, just covering different topics. You can register for these at marioncc.org. and click on the events tab at the top, and that should take you to the spot where you can register for those calls. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Today, Patty Webster and Joe Peterson from Hills Bank are presenting. Welcome, Patty and Joe. Patty is the first Vice President of Treasury Management, and Joe is a Commercial Banking Officer at Hills Bank. Thank you both for presenting today, and I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Jill. Jill had just went through a list of the meetings that are coming up, so just keep in mind that those are all available to you, and don't forget to register. Just to quickly run through the agenda for the call, we're just going to hit upon the importance of banking, community banking, of course, in our community. We're going to share some best practices, whether they be protecting and managing your cash, or the current programs that are available, borrowing options for these new times. And at the end, we will have a time for some questions and answers. So if you think of a question, feel free to submit it during the call, and we will go ahead and make sure we address each and every one of those at the end of the call. Let's start with community banking. We all know that, and we feel in this in Marion and this local community, that it's all about the relationships. This is brand new territory for all of us, and the only way that we're going to get through this is by basically doing it together. Now more than ever, we need to rely on each other and reach out to those that we've built those relationships with. Also, as part of each and every one of us, we're all invested in this community because we do live, work, and play here. So, and toward the end, we will provide a resources page that will give you some links to some very good resources for you folks. We're going to start really quickly, and I'll be real brief, but just to kind of plant the seeds, to some reminders on how to manage your cash flow and how to maybe rethink how you're managing your cash flow a little bit. The first thing, first and foremost, is the accessibility to online banking. It's truly the best way to streamline your daily practices. You can look at the account daily. You can see any transactions or possibly even fraudulent attempts on your accounts and have a quicker turn time with that. And I hate to be the grim reaper on this, but unfortunately, when times like this are happening, there seems to be a lot of extra fraud activity. People are sending phishing emails. They're making fraudulent phone calls. These are just something to be aware of yourself and to also make your staff and employees aware of. The best way to protect yourself is just to keep an eye out for anything that looks a little bit suspicious and reach out to those people. Reach out to your banker. your relationship manager and make sure that they're aware so we can help you there too. The other part of online banking that's really important, especially now, is having remote access to your account. Not only can you, view your accounts without being at a desk or in your office, but if you have employees that you've had to relocate back into their homes, they need to be set up remotely so they can be functional for you. And that's all managed through the online banking portal. Keep in mind that there are simple things that you can set them up to do. They can do at many times mobile deposit. You can also transfer your money from accounts, and you can limit their access. So all of those things are very small but very important things that you can do to help manage your cash flow and keep things working for you on a daily basis. So don't hesitate to reach out and have some help to get that set up. The next piece is ACH, and most of you are probably familiar with that is. It's just electronic receiving and making of payments. So there's collections for payments. It makes those collections come in faster for you. So it does improve the cash flow. You have the capability to set up recurring payments. And that helps a lot of times if you're in the property management business or if you're collecting membership fees or even churches. Folks can't come to church on Sunday, but they want to continue to give. So those are all things just to think about. Positive Pay, I will mention that briefly just because of the fraud aspect that is so important these days. And that will help you actually deter that fraudulent activity by working with your bank to make sure that they're aware of the checks that you have written and or the people that are authorized to either deposit or withdraw from your account via ACH. So anytime anything is presented, I should say, that is not either on that list of checks or is not on that list of authorized people or businesses, then that's flagged for you, and that can easily help protect your accounts. Almost to the last, we've got direct merchant, and direct merchant is simply another fancy name for remote deposit. There's two separate ways that can happen to increase cash flow. If you have people, employees or accountants or someone that does your regular bookkeeping on a daily basis, and they're in charge of doing the deposits, then we can either set them up with a scanner where they can make those deposits remotely, or if it's just a few items at a time, there is mobility. So they can actually make a remote deposit via a mobile app. So these are all really good questions to think about, maybe to ask your banker to see if they can help you with those things in any way. And that very last piece of my section here is the business credit cards. It just helps you to manage your expenses and at the same time protect your bank account because it is separate from a debit card. A debit card is actually remotely accessed to your account. So if indeed, and again, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if someone were to get a hold of that number or that card, you don't want them to have access to your cash. So this helps protect your bank account. It gives those people working remotely access and ability to help you with your daily ongoing business. So anyway, with all that being said, those are just some simple things that you can look at. Maybe you have these in place. If you do, fantastic. If you don't and you've been thinking about it, don't hesitate to reach out to your banker. They will be happy to walk you through it and help you set that up in any way. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe. Joe has been kind of sifting through and filtering through all of the information that's been coming at us so fast on these programs available. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to Joe Peterson. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Patty. So I guess I'll just kind of start by breaking this down, and we'll start with the federal programs, including the SBA and the programs in the CARE Act that were just passed last Friday. And then I'll also touch on some stuff that the state of Iowa is doing locally. So to begin, just best practices. I just want to reiterate everything that Patty said. Just make sure you're paying attention to your to your bank accounts through online banking. The mobile deposit and direct merchant are really good tools to use in this moment, since maybe you can't get into the bank as regular as you would like. So again, just reiterate those points that Patty made on best practices. So some of the current programs that I'm going to touch on today is the Payment Protection Plan, which was part of the CARES Act that was passed on Friday, as well as the Economic Injury Disaster Loans. That's a current program and was available before Friday. They kind of dovetail together in some ways, but in others they're very separate and very distinct. So starting with the CARES Act, the CARES Act the Payment Protection Plan. The Payment Protection Plan, as modified by the CARES Act, is basically a modified SBA 7A loan. And so to access that loan product, you're going to have to go to a banker and somebody that is considered a preferred banker by the SBA. You can find that information on SBA.gov and clicking on their preferred lender search bar and just type in, where you're at, and that will show you all the preferred lenders in your area. The highlights of the Payment Protection Plan is, I guess the goal is that you keep your payroll roughly the same from 2019 to 2020. And that's because basically the government wants to keep people employed. And if you've already had to lay off your workers, you can, as long as you hire them back by June 30, you're still eligible for this Payment Protection Plan. So the whole idea was to keep people employed or get those workers that have been laid off hired back. And so if you do that and you use those funds in a way that that is laid out in the CARES Act, then after about a year, that loan becomes a grant and is satisfied for you by the government. So the highlights of that are you can essentially your loan amount is going to be your payroll, which is salary, tips, other wages, health insurance benefits, retirement plan benefits, and the whatnot. So you basically add all those up from the time period of February 15th, 2019 to June 30, 2019. And then take that number, multiply by 2.5, 250%, and that's your maximum loan amount. Up to $100,000 per employee or $10 million max. And these are available for businesses with less than 500 employees that were in business before March 1st, 2020, and paid salary to employees before that time. You can use those funds then to pay your wages. You can use those funds to pay for insurance benefits, retirement benefits. You can use that loan to pay rent, utilities, and some other obligations, some other debt obligations that were incurred before March 1st, 2020. In my opinion, if you had some term debt, you may be able to use those funds from the Payment Protection Plan to cover those. And again, as long as you use those funds in accordance with the CARES Act, then that would become that loan would become forgivable. It would turn into a grant and be satisfied for you through the 7A program. While this is a modified 7A loan, it's not following standard SBA 7A underwriting. So I've had some questions such as the credit elsewhere test, which is usually attached to SBA 7A loans. That's been suspended for the Payment Protection Plan, as well as some other net worth things that are calculated in a regular SBA 7A loan. Again, those have been suspended by the CARES Act for this Payment Protection Plan. So that's kind of the highlights of the Payment Protection Plan. And I'll wait for questions to get into the nitty-gritty because I could literally be here all day. just talking about all the minor details that go into that. And we also have some resources that lay this out pretty nicely in writing. So I know there's probably a few of you fiercely trying to scribble notes. So we'll get you those resources as well. The other thing I want to touch on is the economic injury disaster loans. The economic injury disaster loans are now available in Iowa in all 99 counties. That's been the case for about the last 2 weeks or so. Basically, one would apply for an economic injury disaster loan to cover expenses not specifically covered in the payment protection plan or the payroll protection plan, excuse me. So, for example, if you had some other economic injury disaster related expenses because of the coronavirus, and they were not payroll, they are not rent payments or mortgage payments or things that I talked about before, that's when you would want to go consider an economic injury disaster loan. You can apply that loan. The economic injury disaster loans are an SBA direct program. So you would go to the SBA directly to apply for that. Again, you can just go to sba.gov to start that application. The one caveat is that if you apply for that payroll protection plan and you also apply for an economic injury disaster loan, you cannot mix and match those funds. You have to keep those funds separate and they have to be used for different things. I've been recommending to all my customers and anybody that asks that you open separate checking accounts and you put your payroll protection plan funds in one checking account. And if you happen to get an economic injury disaster loan, you put those funds in a separate checking account and you keep those funds separate. And that way you can prove you've kept those funds separate. The SBA does not want you mixing those funds. The economic injury disaster loans, that is a loan, that's not a grant. You can get up to $2 million on a 30-year note, and rates for that right now are hovering around that 4% mark. You can get the exact rates, the exact updated rates again on sba.gov. So those are the two big programs through the SBA that are currently available. The other one I want to touch on is the Iowa Economic Development Authority. They have a small business grant program. Those applications are due today by noon. And you can find that application on iowaeconomicdevelopment.com. If you scroll down about a quarter way down the page, you'll see a big button that says COVID-19 response information. Click on the button that says more information. It'll take you right to the application. Again, those are due today by noon. During her press conference, Governor Reynolds said the initial application period was going to be 1 week. So they became available last week on Tuesday, and the initial funds for that were $4 million. She said that based on the number of applications they have and how that program goes, they're certainly willing to extend that deadline and issue more funds for that program. But the initial application period ends today at noon. So that's the Iowa Small Business Grant. And if you are a business that is considered a targeted small business in Iowa, so that is a business that is 51% owned by a woman, minority, or veteran, and you're considered a targeted small business or have an application in as a targeted small business by tomorrow, there is another grant program for targeted small businesses that have 0 employees. So if you are basically self-employed and you fit that criteria, there's another specific grant program for you as well. And the last thing I'll touch on is just talk to your banker. You know, there's always good old-fashioned operating notes that you can do. So your bank, your financial institution is going to have their own underwriting criteria, and those will probably just be the normal underwriting criteria at normal rates, but they're still an option. And I would suggest you reach out to your local lender and just ask, say, hey, are there any options for, what can I do for a operating line of credit or an operating term note? And something else that I would ask is, can I modify my existing loans? Can we do an interest-only period? Can we do a payment deferment? It never hurts to have those conversations with your banker. It never hurts to have those conversations with your lender. And I can tell you personally that we have been doing a lot of loan modifications for our customers because we realize that this is a tough time for everybody and we're willing to help out. So those are just that's like a very broad overview of what's going on. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions more specifically about that payroll protection plan and the CARES Act. And I'm happy to get into that a little more nitty gritty with the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. So we did have a couple of questions that were sent in ahead of time, and you very well might have touched on some of this as you were going through, but we'll go through it again just to reiterate. Can you go into a little bit more detail about who is eligible for these various programs?
Yep, so the payroll protection plan, as laid out in the CARES Act, all you have to be eligible, all you need to be is a small business with less than 500 employees in business by March 1st, 2020, and have made payroll by March 1st, 2020. That's essentially it. There is not a lot of criteria to be eligible for that. Again, some of the regular SBA 7A underwriting, like the credit elsewhere test, and some of the net worth tests have been suspended for this modified 7A program.
Great. Can my banker, here's another one, can my banker help me gather some of the reports needed for these applications?
Yeah, again, just reach out and ask. So some of the things, we don't quite know how the application is going to look. While the CARES Act was passed last Friday, the payroll protection plan loans are not yet available. The SBA is still working on policies and procedures and guidance for that program. I have been paying pretty close attention, and they hope to have that program open to take applications by either this Friday or very early next week. There was some rumors that the Treasury was working on an application and hope to have that up and running within 72 hours of Sunday, 2 days ago. So we'd be about the 48-hour mark, and we have not yet seen that application. So to circle back to the question, some of the things that you're going to need are how much you paid in payroll, what the total amount was for your insurance benefits, for your retirement benefits, if you paid any tips, if you paid any commissions, wages, hourly wages. Gather all that information up, because that's all the information that you're going to need. And that will help determine the size of the loan. So then you basically multiply that by 2.5, and that will be your maximum loan amount, as long as it's less than 100,000 per employee or 10 million max. Something else I would suggest rounding up is you'll probably have to prove you're in business before March 1st, 2020. So if you have your articles of organization or articles of incorporation available, if you don't, you can find those on the Iowa Secretary of State website and just print those off. And the other thing is that you paid payroll by then, so that you'll have all your payroll information as well.
Okay, great. Here is a question from one of our viewers. I looked at the application. It says to cover losses due to the coronavirus 3/15 to 4/15. As an irrigation company, we really don't start until mid-April going full on. So losses right now are not really the issue. What will cause us issues is in April and May, if we're unable to get out and do startups of irrigation and installs. Does it seem that there may be another option to do this in the April or May timeframe? I'm guessing we would not qualify at this point. And she's talking about specifically the Iowa Economic Development Authority grant.
I know slightly less about the Iowa Economic Development Authority grant. and how that works. What I can tell you about the payroll protection plan loan is you can use those funds through December 31st, 2020. So even if you had that payroll, if you were to secure a payroll protection plan loan, you would not necessarily need to use those funds immediately. You can use those funds basically throughout the rest of 2020. And then that would obviously then cover that summer timeframe.
Joe, can you talk a little bit about sort of that truing up of I think it was the payroll protection program specifically that's going to happen after the fact. So say a business gets one of the grants and they get their pot of money, do they have to spend it, or what happens if they don't end up spending it on payroll related?
Yeah, yep. Good question. So if you were to get a payroll protection plan and you were to use those funds for other than what's listed in the CARES Act, you would basically diminish the amount forgiven, and anything left over would convert to a regular 7A, a regular SBA 7A loan at basically a 10-year loan at no more than 4% interest. So for example, if you had a $15,000 loan through the payment protection or the I keep saying payroll protection plan, and you use 10,000 of that to cover payroll, to cover all those expenses, and you used 5,000 to purchase let's say a new vehicle for your business, that 5,000 would not be forgiven. And at the end, instead of that becoming a grant, that would turn into a regular 7A loan on a 10-year amortization at no more than 4% interest. So again, what I had mentioned earlier about setting up separate checking accounts or setting up a separate checking account for those funds, that way you can, at the end, when you go to ask for forgiveness, you can have a detailed account and detailed record of how those funds were used. I would certainly also keep payment receipts, or if you're using those funds to cover retirement, deposit receipts. That way you have all that ready to go at the end when you go to ask for forgiveness for that on that payroll protection plan.
Awesome, thank you. To go back to Julie's question about the IDEA grant. From what we're hearing, there's been quite a lot, just a huge amount actually, of applications that have been submitted, more than that they will probably be able to fund. So I think that it's just, if you haven't pulled up the application yet to look at it, it's a good idea to do that so that you are at least aware of all of the information that you're going to have to provide. A lot of the applications are pretty similar, so it's just good to have those financial documents in place and those types of things. So and I'm sure other programs will be rolling out, when those programs do roll out, businesses are going to be prepared to fill out those applications and provide that information. So I just wanted to mention that. And it doesn't hurt to apply. All they can say is no, and then your application's gonna, it's already prepared. So when the next round does come through, you'll be ready. Here's another question that was submitted ahead of time. This is, I think, in relation to the payroll protection plan. What if I have already laid off my staff? How can I take advantage of that program?
Yep, you can still apply, and as long as you rehire your staff by June 30, you're all well and good. So if you've had to lay them off because of you're short on operating funds, if you apply, receive your funds on the payroll protection plan, and hire your employees back by June 30, you're good to go.
Okay. One more question. Would you recommend a business applying for all options, or should they be choosy? Is there any of the applications conflict? Meaning if you apply for one, you're not eligible for another, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I recommend everybody apply for everything. I mean, why not? Again, the worst thing they're going to say is no, and you're just right back where you started. The only caveat to that, and I touched on this earlier, was if you apply for the payroll protection plan and an economic injury disaster loan, do not, and you receive both, do not mix those funds. Those are both those funds both come from the SBA, and they do not want you mixing those funds. So again, setting up separate accounts, separate checking accounts or separate savings accounts and keeping detailed records of where those funds were used will be critical. If you receive a payroll protection plan and maybe a loan from your bank and say the Iowa Small Business Grant, there's no restrictions on those funds. Those can be, used as you will. It's just the payroll protection plan and an economic injury disaster loan, because those funds both come from the SBA. Don't mix those funds.
Great. Okay, are there any other questions out there? I don't see any more rolling up in our queue, Joe and Patty. So I'll give you guys a minute just to wrap up if there's not any more questions.
Yeah, I would just say, Patty, if you maybe go to the next card, you'll show our contact information. Feel free to reach out to Patty or I with any questions. We are happy to help in any way we can. There are many, many details in that payroll protection plan, and I doubt you want to sit here all day listening to me chat about that bill. So if you have any questions or very specific questions, please feel free to ask. If you simply Google the CARES Act, there are a lot of really nice summaries of that bill. There's a really nice summary called the Small Business Guide, published by the Senate, that I have been relying on myself, that lays out really nicely that bill and all the highlights. I've read the bill myself, and it's not that complicated. The language is not that dense. So, if you're feeling up to it, just go find the copy of that bill and just read it. And I would also encourage people to reach out to their accountants or their attorneys. I've seen a lot of resources from accountants and attorneys as well. Reach out to all those connections that you have.
Joe, I do have one more question that just came in. Maybe this was addressed and we might have missed it, but when can we expect to be able to apply for the payroll protection program loan?
Yep. So good question. As of yesterday, communication directly from the SBA was that those are not yet ready. So while it is law, they were sort of lacking in the policies and procedures part, just because that law moved through Congress so fast. They didn't really have time to put a lot of policies and procedures in place. So they're working on those right now. There was a conference call yesterday. I did not watch it, but I had some colleagues, and Senator Marco Rubio, who wrote that bill, was on that conference call. And his statement was they hope to be able to start taking applications for the payroll protection plan either this Friday or very early next week. We're just waiting on the SBA to get things sort of wrapped up on their end. Maybe one caveat I will throw in is that with that payroll protection plan, you will be going through a local lender, and a lot of local lenders are still working on ramping up their internal capacity. They're coming, they will help. We just ask that maybe everybody be slightly more patient, as tough as that may be. There's going to be a lot of requests, and everybody's just working on ramping up capacity. The good news is that they're pretty straightforward and pretty easy to underwrite, and that was kind of the whole point. And Senator Rubio did mention that their goal is to be able to go from application to funding in 2 to 3 days once these become available.
Okay. So as people or businesses are waiting for these, Joe, if they are in a crunch now, could they apply for some type of bridge loan through their local lender? And then could that grant from the payroll protection program be used to pay back that kind of bridge loan or whatever you might call that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer to that is no. You cannot refinance a regular bank loan into a payroll protection plan. You can certainly go to your local lender. You can certainly get a small bridge loan, but that will be a loan that will have to be paid back on terms set forth by your bank and your lender or your financial institution. And those will not be, you cannot then refi that into a payment protection plan. There is one option. If you were to apply for an economic injury disaster loan after February 15th, 2020, in relation to the COVID-19 outbreak, you can refi that loan into a payment protection plan. Essentially, they're both SBA loans, and so they'll let you do it. But that is the only way you could refinance something using a payroll protection plan is as if you had an economic injury disaster loan after February 15th, 2020 in relation to COVID-19.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions out there? I'm not seeing any. So Patty and Joe, I really want to thank you and Hills Bank for presenting today. That was great information, very helpful to our business community. And I just want to remind everyone of our other upcoming virtual meetings. Starting with Thursday, we're going to try networking virtually. That should be interesting. Our virtual Wake Up Marion, and that will be with Coldwell Banker. Mike Esker is going to give us an overview of how COVID-19 is impacting the real estate industry. So hope you guys will all sign up for that and the others that we have scheduled. Patty and Joe, do you have anything else to add before we end the call?
No, just once again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We are available.
Thank you all for joining.
Very good. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.